Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about comic books and why I love them so much. I think sometimes people get the impression, especially in the modern era, that anybody who's a fan of superhero stuff or sci fi or any of that doesn't really read comic books anymore, which I kind of understand because reading is a bit of a sadly dying art. But I'm actually a big fan of comic books. Not all of them, I'm selective, but the media and format in general. I love, love, love to collect comic books. I know you can see the ones behind me. I love to collect covers of different characters that I like and enjoy, partially because I see them as art, and I think that it's really cool to display them and share them with people, but also I love to read the comic books. Now, the reason that I love reading comic books is because they have access to so many different worlds. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, but that's the case in literally anything, isn't it? You can watch so many different movies, cartoons, you can watch pretty much whatever you want, play video games. And while you are right about that, one thing that's unique about comic books is the buy in. And what I mean by that is that while it is not cheap to make a comic book, right? While it is not cheap to get a top level writer or a top level artist, it is doable, especially on a budget compared to other types of media. This has allowed comic books to really branch out pretty much forever and really create almost unlimited worlds and stories that I think are really, really cool. I actually have some examples of that as well in things that would cost a massive budget to create, but on a comic book scale are still super duper enjoyable and interesting, but are makeable without millions and millions of dollars. A great example of this is actually the Darth Vader comic series. There have been a few of these. The one I'm talking about, I always get the writers mixed up, but the one that I'm talking about, this takes place between episodes 4 and 5, if I'm remembering correctly. I read it a little while ago. But one of the things that I love about the story in this is that it really focuses on elements of Darth Vader that you wouldn't actually see otherwise in a movie. And you might think, well, couldn't they just make a movie about Darth Vader? But if you look at something simple as just all the shots, making this story would be quite expensive in a physical, I guess I should say physical sense, like props or anything like that, or even animation. But in a comic book, it's still doable to make this story and expand this character, even a household name like Darth Vader, in a different way and in a different media format, and for people to experience in a different way. So it doesn't only allow you to get invested in something like, say, the Star Wars universe and watch it or play a video game, but also to read something about it. I've always found this really fun with comic books because I think they really, I guess I would say, test the imagination. You know, they make you think. Now, novels, I'm sure they do it more because they make you imagine absolutely everything. But even with a comic book, there's a lot of implied action and other stuff in them that I think is really, really fun that you get to experience as a reader. It's also worth mentioning with that because we talked about different worlds and stuff like that, this also allows you to do things that would never ever be made if you didn't have this. Now, sorry, I was kind of reaching down, but something like Avatar: The Last Airbender. This is something I'm a huge fan of. I did not actually grow up with Avatar: The Last Airbender. I have literally zero nostalgia for it. I watched it for the first time, I would say 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. It was before my wife moved here, so probably a year and a half ago. But with Avatar: The Last Airbender, what ended up happening was Nickelodeon, who produced this show, they always had some, I guess I should say, stringent rules on what could be shown on their network. For example, things like certain relationships couldn't be shown, characters that were LGBTQ or other things were often implied and not shown, and even certain heterosexual relationships and other stuff like that were kind of brushed under the rug. Violence was shied away from, and they kind of tried to work their way around different topics and issues and force the writers of a show like Avatar to do the same, even when they didn't want to. One thing that I love about something like the books is that even though Nickelodeon doesn't seem to have an interest anymore in making animated series very much, I hope to be proven wrong at some point, they can continue to actually get the original writers and other people to work on stories set in that universe with less restrictions because it's not airing on broadcast television. This actually allows you to make more creative and interesting stories. I'm not necessarily saying that these comics are better than the show, but they're able to branch out in different directions while remaining true to the heart of that show. I think this is something you see a lot with comic books. You know, a great example of that is Batman 89, which I think Jill, who's holding the camera, can pan up just a tiny bit. I'm a big fan of this version of Batman, but he's very, very different from the movies. And one thing that's really cool about comic books is that even though Michael Keaton is much older and they're not really able to do all the same things with him that they could have done if they had made those decisions in the past, is comic books are timeless. They are timeless stories. They don't revolve around the aging of actors or the aging of writers. Stories can be passed down into new hands, and versions of characters, even that we've seen on screens, can be elaborated and expanded on the page. A great example of that, actually, too, other than just 89, is something like The Dark Knight Returns. Now, I know Frank Miller is a bit of a hot button issue. Some people have really hated him ever since things like Holy Terror or The Dark Knight Strikes Again. And some people, like me, have really loved him selectively. Like, for example, I love Dark Knight Returns, I love Year One, I love Master Race, and I actually am a big fan of a story like The Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade. This is a comic that actually focuses on his own universe, Miller's universe of Batman, and it kind of tackles the storyline of death in the family, but in a different way, you know, in that universe. One thing I love about this is that this is somewhere where you can see a sequel to a storyline from decades ago. It's technically a prequel, and it hasn't aged. That's one thing I find so fascinating about comics is you can go back and write a book. You know, we've seen this happen to varying degrees of success in normal books too. Like, for example, you probably wouldn't want to go back with Daniel Radcliffe for Harry Potter and try and make a prequel, right? I mean, because he's way older. It's going to be really hard to do. But we saw in the books, you know, you have something like The Cursed Child where they make a sequel type of story, play and then JK's involved, blah, 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 blah. And they're able to kind of move that story on in a different direction. Some people hated it, some people really liked it. But the point that I'm making is one thing I love about these types of things and books in general and comic books especially is that they're able to do that. Sequels, prequels, any kind of thing that you want to see, they can go ahead and do that and write more into that world. Now, that's been a blessing and a curse because sometimes it's gone very, very horribly, like Miller's Dark Knight Strikes Again. I'm really not a fan of that book. It's bad art, and I really don't like the story very much. Although, you know, controversial take, the Flash's costume in black, pretty cool. And there's some neat stuff in there, like what they did with Carrie Kelly and the Sons of Batman. But my point that I'm getting at is that with all of this, it's very, very unique. Take something like Superior Spider-Man. You are able to take a character like Spider-Man and completely change him up and do new things that you would never, ever see in a movie, I don't think. Because this story focuses on Dr. Otto Octavius, which is Doc Ock, becoming Spider-Man for quite a while in the comic books. It's actually a lasting change that lasts for a while. This isn't probably something you'd see in a movie or, even, I mean, maybe in a video game eventually, but it's just not as likely because those are such big buy-in products that you have to spend so much money making and have to make so much money back. This allows you to target niche audiences and tell smaller niche stories that I think really work with the imagination to make fun things. I think also the other thing I wanted to talk about with this, and I know this is not a super structured video because I'm kind of just, winging it with the ideas in my head, but is how you can make big universes out of small things. So take, for example, something like Sonic the Hedgehog. This is a video game. It's a very simple game series about a running fast hedgehog who saves animals and fights robots.
If you blink, you miss him.
Yeah, that's true. Doctors hate him because he finishes so fast, technically. But here's the thing with Sonic the Hedgehog. That seems like just a very simple idea. How are you going to expand that? What are you going to do with that? The thing is, you can take it in a comic book and expand it far, far more deeply than someone could back when it was originally conceptualized because it was, limited by technology and time. You have more room for narrative, more room for characters to grow. And I think that's really interesting because then you get to see all these different versions of characters. And, the games actually follow that same sort of thing with Sonic the Hedgehog, for example, where they've tried to make it more complex and stuff as it's gone on. But the point I'm getting at with all of this is that it's really cool to see all these unique versions of characters. Speaking of niches, yes, obviously things like Spider-Man, we love him. We love him to death. Watchmen, one of the, in my opinion, greatest stories ever told in fiction. Crisis on Infinite Earths with Superman, Vampirella, Harley Quinn, all these are iconic characters, right? But one thing that I love with comic books is because of that small buy-in to actually make them, anyone can make a comic book. A big thing that we've been seeing recently is a massive surge of indie comics, from things like Todd McFarlane making Spawn and that just completely taking off quite a while ago, to even characters that have been made up by, webtoons creators and other people. Like, we're starting to enter an age where people can just make their own thing. You have independent artists and writers working on their own stuff, crowdfunding, kickstarting, all these other things, Patreon, Indiegogo, and being able to create their own worlds. And even outside of that, the ability for an independent creator to grow, you also have, even in the big companies, the room for chance and the room to take a chance on a character or idea that might not sell well in another format of media. A great example of this is comics like Black Cat, a character that you probably would not see, an entire big, huge thing made about, although Sony was working on it. I don't know if they ever will, comparatively to a comic book where you're able to expand and explain that character and give her a more human and realistic feeling than just, cameoing or showing up in some Spider-Man stories. I also love things like the old extended universe for Star Wars. They have been, obviously since Disney bought it, they've been doing new stuff other than this, but I love this cover. I think it's beautiful. And I love how they're able to expand all these niche and unique characters and bring you into that world of Star Wars without having to make 500 trillion movies. They can make comic books, video games, the sky is the limit novels. I love the imagination and even ideas from something like DC, where you see a continuation of the Justice League cartoon in Justice League Infinity, or the Batman cartoon of, Batman the Animated Series in something like Batman The Adventures Continue. Those are things that you wouldn't really necessarily see in a different media format as much, but comics are able to do it. I grew up reading comics, and comics always really stuck with me because they were able to take me to new worlds and experience and meet new characters. While I do think that it's very much easier now to get people to buy into these characters because there are these mainstream huge movies and stuff, these comics have always been able to tackle more complex ideas with less blowback. Storylines like Iron Man's Demon in a Bottle, for example, or even, Batman Year One, where they're able to tackle very, very heavy concepts and interesting ideas that maybe studios and executives who are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a budget wouldn't quite necessarily be so ready to jump on. We saw that with the MCU and Demon in a Bottle, where Tony Stark's alcoholism was a little bit more shied away from because it was such a dark topic. I finally do want to say that the imagination of these is really, really what takes the cake for me. Because an idea that I hope maybe we can see eventually in a game or movie, but who knows, that we've been seeing in comics is something like DC versus Marvel. This was done all the way back, I believe it was in the 90s. I think it was the mid-90s because I was very young when this was coming out. And one of the things that was really interesting was it was something that had been talked about for years. Like, what would happen if Superman fought the Hulk? Or what would happen if Batman squared up against Captain America? These were questions that nerds like me had fun debating and talking about on the playground and being like, no, Batman would beat Captain America, and stuff like that. It was so fun to have these almost collaborative experiences in these worlds where you got to know these characters and understand who they are and rally behind them and their cause. And you got to see them as a human being and experience science fiction and fantasy and all these other things in new ways on the page. And I absolutely love ideas like this where you get to see this creativity manifest itself in a comic. So I guess this was a bit of a rambly video, kind of all over the place, but to recap, I absolutely love the imagination of comics. I love exploring these new worlds and characters, and I love that there's so many versions of them. If you are, if you're not even into someone like Spider-Man, you might enjoy Superior Spider-Man. You might enjoy Ox Time as Spider-Man. I know that sounds like heresy to some people, but it really is true. Or if you're a mega fan of Spider-Man, you might enjoy that too. If you're not really a big, huge fan of Star Wars and you're kind of wondering, what does everyone get out of this? And you read some comics, there might be something that clicks for you, something you really enjoy. Or even if you're not impressed by a version of a character on screen, say Iron Man, Spider-Man, or others, even Batman, there's going to be a version of that character for you in the comics that's really cool. Yes, there's consistency in the main continuity, or at least there should be, but there's an entire multiverse of ideas and fun concepts and things for you to enjoy. I love comic books. I love the worlds. I'd be interested to hear what are some of your favorite comic books ever, favorite storylines, issues, whatever you want to talk about. One of the most underrated, my wife wants me to stop doing this because I think she is tired of holding this, but I was going to say before I go.
No, I just wanted to ask, are you going to be the new host of Reading Rainbow?
I should be. But I think that I don't think I would be well read enough to be. I think they should just get LeVar back.
That makes sense.
They were going to get him for some game show. I thought it was Jeopardy or something that didn't work out. I don't remember, but hey, he's probably free. You could ask him. He hasn't been on Star Trek Picard yet. But one thing I was going to say is that there's a lot of also niche hidden gems with comics that I think are really cool. One of my favorite comic books of all time is the Sensational Spider-Man issue 40. This is a very, very interesting storyline. It's almost a one-off following the events of the original Civil War comic where Peter Parker revealed his identity to the world. And there's a lot of very interesting stuff in here. This book alone tackles concepts and ideas of religion, place in the world, being a hero, and what it means. And if Spider-Man has any impact, positive or negative, on the world around him. And that's all in this thin comic book. And it's done well. I love that. This is like the one type of media where I think you can see that sort of thing done. And there's not pushback. There's not a bunch of people rebelling against the ideas and wanting to shut it down and cancel it and go away from it. There was back with the Comics Code Authority way back, but luckily that's gone. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I will stop rambling. Please let me know what are some of your favorite issues, storylines, like I said, any of that stuff, or characters. And if you're not already subscribed, we are at over 105,000 subscribers now, which is amazing thanks to you. Yes, we make the content, but without you watching it, what's the point, right? We're just yelling into the void like a crazy madman. So, have a fantastic day. As always, everyone, stay shway.